He's been watching China's rising economy for nearly 25 years, negotiated the first business deals and worked to open channels between the United States and Chinese governments. Now, former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson is sharing his thoughts about China in a new book. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China now has the world's second biggest economy, and it's likely to surpass the United States in the coming years. How did China become an economic superpower so quickly, and how is business really done there? That's what former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson set out to answer in his new book, Dealing with China, an Insider Unmasked, the New Economic Superpower. We'll speak with Secretary Paulson in a moment, but first a closer look at his career in the financial industry.
Let's get it now. Okay, let's get it.
Hank Paulson is the first to say he's not a scholar or a theorist. He describes himself as a businessman, a conservationist, author and expert on China. During his 32-year career with the investment bank Goldman Sachs, Paulson travelled to China more than 100 times and worked on deals with Chinese corporate and political leaders. From 2006 to 2009, he served as US Treasury Secretary under President George W. Bush. Paulson was at the helm in 2008 when a financial crisis rocked the US and world economy. The fourth largest US investment bank, Lehman Brothers, declared bankruptcy. Brokerage firm Merrill Lynch was sold to Bank of America for roughly $50 billion. And financial institutions faced hundreds of billions of dollars in losses because of bad mortgage finance and real estate investments. Companies laid off workers by the millions. Home foreclosures were rampant, and the US stock market plummeted. Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, testified before the Senate Banking Committee requesting a $700 billion bailout for the banks.
We must now take further decisive action to fundamentally and comprehensively address the root cause of this turmoil.
The bailout, known as the Troubled Assets Relief Program, helped companies like American International Group, Citigroup and Bank of America stay afloat. While many Americans were outraged by the bailout for Wall Street, many economists credit the measures taken by the Federal Reserve with helping to avoid another depression. And today, Hank Paulson is the founder and chairman of the Paulson Institute at the University of Chicago. Hank Paulson is here with us now in our Washington, D.C. studios. Thank you, Secretary Paulson, for joining us. We really appreciate it. Your new book talks about the unmasking of the new economic superpower. In your view, how did China do this so quickly?
It's a remarkable story. I think it's a story of the power of markets, and it's a story of very, very strong leaders who were willing to make some pretty dramatic changes and make them pretty quickly. And in the first part of the book, Dealing with China, I tell the story of working with a number of these men, people like former Premier Zhu Rongji, Wang Qishuang, who's now on the Standing Committee, Zhou Xiaotren, and the steps that they took using capital markets transactions, landmark transactions like the China Mobile IPO, PetroChina, Bank of China, to bring capital and to China, and really to use those as a lever to expose the economy to more competition and market practices.
You do go into immense detail about the people who made this transformation happen within China, which is fantastic for people who haven't looked on the inside of China, and it's an outsider's view as well. But it's not all rosy in your book. I just want to read one of the quotes. When you talk about Chinese debt, frankly, it's not a question of if, but when China's financial system, particularly the trust companies, will face a reckoning and have to contend with a wave of credit losses and debt restructuring. That's a warning, but you also say that Chinese leadership now is well aware of the problem and has a plan to fix it. How do you think that's going, and where do you see it going?
Well, Nathan, to put this in perspective, this is a $10 trillion economy. The economic model, which has gotten them this far, is running out of steam and needs to be rebooted. And that quote really talks about the problem in a municipal finance system, because China has been overly reliant on municipal investment into infrastructure to drive growth. And debts have been growing much quicker than the economy has been growing. And so to fix that, they need a new growth model, one that is more dependent on the private sector, opening up sectors to competition, and slowing down this buildup of municipal debt. And so I look much less at the growth rate. Obviously, this country is going to grow at a lower rate, and the new normal is going to be 7% or less. But the important thing to me is what's driving that growth, and to see them looking to the right things, as opposed to going back and having a lot more stimulus and supporting infrastructure.
Yes, you're right, because if you look at, for example, industries they're investing in, service industries, the growth rate is much quicker there. Yeah. So you're seeing a rebalancing of the Chinese economy. Do you wish you'd had such a warning when you were Treasury Secretary?
Well, let me say this.
It's just the parallels were interesting to me.
It's very, very difficult to predict the timing and the magnitude of any financial crisis. And most financial crises, can be handled and managed without spilling over and doing real damage to the underlying global economy. But every 75, 100 years or so, you have a really, really big one. And I'll tell you, by the time I was in office, these excesses had been building up for a long time. This bubble had been going on for 10 years. And so I'm looking back on it, there was a lot of things that we obviously wish we could have avoided. But given what we were faced with the tools we had, I think that the programs we put in place were pretty successful in avoiding the very worst outcomes, and because we were pretty close to a collapse of the economy.
Yes, there was no depression. You also talk a lot in this book about the US-China relationship. You also have 8 points that I've read about how the relationship should be transformed. What are they, and what do you think is going wrong and right at the moment?
Well, I would say this. The reason I wrote this book, Nathan, is I think this is the most important bilateral relationship there is in the world today. And I think it's more complex and more difficult, because with China's success, China has grown into a formidable competitor. So we're competing on the one hand and partnering on the other.
And that competition can be very healthy, too.
Yeah, the competition can be very healthy, good for both, or it could, it could degrade into sort of a debilitating, destructive competition. So I think it's very important that, and the way to keep that competition healthy is to make sure in the areas where we're partnering, because we have many shared interests, that we work together to get some important things done. Because I make the point, the reason I think this is such an important relationship is if you look at the major challenges in the global situation today, whether we're talking about environmental issues like climate change, economic issues like sustaining economic growth, whether we're talking about peace and stability, denuclearization, all of those are easier to meet if we're working in complementary ways with China, and much more difficult if we're working at cross purposes.
So how do we achieve that? I mean, you're ex-financial guy. You would set up different structures to deal with these issues, and one of them really stuck out at me, where you said the US needs a point person in the administration to deal with China. Why is that, and who should that be? Because it has been a little confused, right?
Well, the point I make is we set up the Strategic Economic Dialogue when I was in Washington, and this was designed, I think, to help decision-making in both countries. China has a diffuse decision-making structure, and I think that what the SED did was help coordinate, prioritize, so we could focus on getting some very important things done. That evolved to become the Strategic and Economic Dialogue,
yeah.
which I think by and large has been quite successful. And I'm really positive about this joint climate change agreement. So there have been some very good things coming out of it. But the point I made is if there's one person coordinating policy in the U.S., it's easier to speak with a clear voice and stay on track.
So who should that be? Potentially a vice president level?
Well, I had said if in a very different model, you would have it all coordinated by perhaps a vice president in the U.S. and a premier in China.
Because it does, China has continuity in terms of its leadership, and things change here every couple of years in Congress and every 4 years or 8 years in the presidency, and also there seems to be lots of different views within any administration. So is that part of the problem?
Well, I think it's on both sides also. If you look at many of my friends in the United States say, well, China is an authoritarian government, so the man at the top can just make clear decisions and get implemented easily throughout the country. And of course, when you look at what Xi Jinping is attempting to do, which is transform China and make dramatic changes, not just in the economic model and the urbanization model, but modernizing the government, changing the relationship between the center and the provinces, big changes with the military, foreign policy, and so on. There is not a consensus in all those areas, and the lack of consensus means it's going to take time to get things done. So the SED, I think, helps build consensus, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue in both China and the U.S. by getting a good number of people together on both sides, those that have got the clear responsibility for the issues and others that don't have clear responsibility but are going to be weighing in on the decisions.
You met President Xi very early on in his career. You were an American businessman traveling to provincial China. What do you think of his leadership and where he's trying to go?
Well, he is, I don't think ever in the history of the world have you seen someone try to make so much change in such a massive scale. To me, it's just extraordinary. When you look at everything from rebooting the economy so that the markets will be decisive, changing the urbanization model, the stunningly broad and pervasive anti-corruption campaign. So he's got, and modernizing government. So you have to be impressed that he not only is trying to do all this, laid out the vision, but taking personal responsibility for it. But the job is a very, very difficult one, and I think he's got some significant challenges ahead of him.
Yeah, there is lots of changes of policy going on in Asia generally. I want to bring up just one example, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, because that was seen by China as a model for investment, much needed investment in Asia. And yet the US administration quietly and not so quietly lobbied allies not to join it, from Japan, Australia to European members. It now has nearly 60 founding members. Is that an example of how Washington should have cooperated more with China?
Yeah, I don't like to criticize my government because I think they've done many, many things well, and you occasionally make mistakes. I think that was a mistake, that the right policy, we should be welcoming China into the multilateral institutions, which and working to have them play a bigger role. And then when you look at infrastructure, this is something the United States doesn't do. China is a leader. China is a leader through the XM Bank and the Development Bank, the China Development Bank. Setting this up was designed to meet a real need in Asia. They need a lot of infrastructure. The right thing was for the United States to work together with them, certainly not to oppose. Now, I don't look at this as a huge watershed that so many people do, and I look at it as a case where maybe better coordination and focus would have helped. And so.
One final question. You know, we saw you on television all the time during the financial crisis. It must have been very stressful, although you don't look like you've aged at all. What lessons did you learn then, back in 2007, 2008, which you could turn around now to the Chinese government and say, look, I've learned this. Please take it on board.
There's a lot of lessons, but I'd say the big overarching lesson is this. I don't care what the economic system is, what the political system is, as long as you have governments, banks, and capital markets, you will have financial crises. And the financial crises begin with flawed government policies. Banks always get the blame. They deserve a lot of the blame, but the fundamental cause are flawed government policies. And so the key is how you deal with the crises and that you don't let the excesses build up and become too great. So China has some flawed policies. Models that worked well in the past aren't working as well now. So the key thing is to correct those early on. And the sooner you deal with that, the better. Because just take the flawed municipal finance system. If it takes years to correct that, then the excesses will build up and the cost will be much greater. I take comfort from the fact that the Chinese understand that, and the Minister of Finance, Lo Jiwei, his big focus is correcting that. And the Xi Jinping administration inherited an economy where reform had stalled for the previous 10 years. And so reform had stalled. They have to deal with that, and they're dealing with it expansively. But it's easier said than done, because there are people that are always going to resist making changes.
Hank Paulson, such a fascinating discussion, former US Treasury Secretary, dealing with China. An Insider Unmasked, the New Economic Superpower is his new book. Thank you. Next, we'll discuss China's economy with leading economists on Asia and check in on the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Stay with us on The Heat.